after the human ship jumped in and immediately cloaked itself, not only with the ability to block any type of energy signature, but also thermal, along with visual as well. Not a single chance could be taken in this situation. Gregnar sat in her seat, watching all this happen, amazed as she watched all the screens click into a different red or green situation. She didn't understand what was going on. She was trying to read it as fast as she could, but it was flipping through so fast that she was barely able to catch any of it, although much of it was physics. She recognized some, but this was all questionable physics. This shouldn't be a thing. Most of this was thought up to just be theory, something they wouldn't be able to prove for another 100 or so years at the earliest. But as she looked at it, she saw things like quantum entanglement and so on. She saw other parts, different sort of quantum energies were being focused in different ways. Also with that, different type of, was that shielding? No, that wasn't shielding. Maybe, what was this? It wasn't long before she realized that it was the optical camouflage that was being gone through. And now she realized what makes humans very dangerous. They drifted silently in the darkness of space towards the closest fleet. The Celtipsian fleet was the ones who mainly focused on the Forced, Greknar's home species. Though they were many jumps away from Forst's home world, she could see that there was a fight going on, way off in the distance. Different flashes seemed to be pulsating. When they zoomed in as much as the optics allowed, they could see the different rays of lights, different greens, blues, yellows, in some cases pinks, were flying across. Along with that, she could see different projectiles flying around. There was different fighters, if you could call them that, different ships trying to move around themselves, all in order to get a good shot at their supposed enemy. On one side, she could see mostly Celtipsian ships, but also a mix of Zeknekal cruisers as well. In there, on the other side, she could see the Forced, and the Force alone. They were not doing well. She started to get up and started begging Larry to go faster, to get there sooner. He simply asked her to wait. She had to yell at him, "Why, my people, they're dying out there. Why won't you fire?" Larry opened his eyes for once, seeming looking over all the screens at the same time, yet speaking directly to her. "We're not within range yet. If I fire now, they'll know where we are, they'll be able to avoid it, and we lose the element of surprise." "Why is that so important? I know it's always good to get the first shot, but no, it's not just important to get the first shot. It is all important to get the first shot. You never underestimate that, ever. Not in naval warfare, ever. One of my best friends was a Navy officer. He taught me all about it. And he was not kidding. He had some stories, let me tell you." And with that, Larry closed his eyes again. Gregnar unbuckled herself and began to move up in a way where she could see Larry's face, and what she saw put a chill down her spine. She could see that usually the soft smile that was there, the grin, the lightness in his eyes, the caringness that he always showed her, especially when training or whenever dealing with the injury of herself or another. He was always so helpful, so kind, so generous, so soft in the way he was. But now she saw something she couldn't explain. He was robotic. Not a hint of emotion was in his face at all. Even though his eyes were closed, there was no movement of the eyes, except for inside, almost as though he was in REM sleep. But the eyebrows, no facial twitches, no smile or anything was on his face. He was just there, solely focused on his mission and nothing else. She realized there was a reason she hadn't seen it before. Normally, during the games, she can't see a human's face. They cover it up with a mask or with what they call face paint. something to make it impossible for them to see. Hell, the first time she saw him and he stood up and said, "Boo." He had a veil over his face and she couldn't even see his eyes because underneath the veil he had dark lenses. She realized he was wearing the dark lenses to make sure that the whites of his eyes couldn't be seen, and he covered the rest of his face. Why would they do this? Perhaps, she thought, it was because the humans, if anyone was to see how serious, how robotic, how focused and stoic they would be when they are under attack, it would scare the scales off even the Zeknekel or even a Vunshin. This was enough to make her pause. Larry didn't say anything, and they simply still drifted through space. It would take at least 35 minutes before they got within range, and as they did, he started giving out commands. "Aya, are the weapons charged?" "Yes, sir." "Chief, is everyone ready to go?" "Yes, sir." "Good. As soon as we open up, everyone's got to be in their positions." With that, lights began to key up, and there was 50, 60, 70, over 100 different lights keyed all of a sudden. Gregnar couldn't understand what was going on. These simply were open symbols that pinged blue. This she couldn't understand. Yet she would find out very quickly. Reaching the edge of that 35 minutes, Larry simply said, "Strap in. Now." With that, Gregnar gave no words, just ran over to her seat and strapped in as fast as she could. Just as she pulled the last strap tight, she heard the command from Larry. "Ready all forward cannons. Open fire." And with that, not only did the weapons fire, but the optical camouflage dropped as well. Along with that, all the secondary and tertiary weapons began to fire as well. All sorts of railguns began to fire out with a thump, 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 firing as fast as the weapons could charge up themselves, reload another round, and fire. She realized that she was right into, as in just starting to enter, the enemy formation. They didn't even realize what was going on. Point blank range, he was firing massive railgun rounds that would perforate the ship from stem to stern if he wasn't looking broadside. Some of the weapons that were being fired were kinetic rounds, but they were also explosive. They would sink into the hull and explode, blowing several compartments apart. This caused many of the ships to simply buckle and shift, not realizing what in the holy hell was just going on. All they knew is their ship was being torn off next to them. By the time many of them realized that a human ship just popped up next to them, it was too late. Most of the smaller ships had been shot all to hell, and before they even realized what was going on, out of the dorsal and ventral hangars flew a whole bunch of fighters, corvettes, and even a half a dozen frigates from both sides. It was now its own mobile fleet. And with that, inside was a thinking AI, death with a circuit board. And each of them went to their specific target. If that target was already taken out, they immediately changed to another one and began firing. Most of them used their main guns to fire through the larger ships. This time, they aimed for the engines, and if they couldn't get the engines, they aimed for the bridge, wherever that might be. The scans went off, and I was immediately giving all sorts of data to everyone. Gregnar looked, and Larry was locked in position, holding himself, all his muscles tensed, as though everything was going through his mind at the same time. His brain had turned into the navigations and weapons computer of the ship and started to coordinate where the ship was flying, where the main guns were firing. Aya took over the secondary effects, along with taking care of any of the wounded coming in, making sure everyone was where they needed to be. It was a strange dance, but a magical one, as the Celtipsian fleet was torn to ribbons in less than a minute. The Zeknekel immediately turned their cruisers and destroyers towards the human ship, and this was a bad idea. If they wanted to pick a fight, it was too late. Larry's ship immediately targeted them and began to fire. Before many of them even were able to turn, the frigates on either side came out and fired their main guns and again pierced them, ending their run. The battle itself, from decloaking to the last ship disabled, took 3 minutes and 48 seconds. With that, Larry began scanning. Greknar could see the scans on several different of the screens. These were all different types of scans going out left, right, center, all over on different frequencies, looking for all sorts of things, whether it be living items, whether it be things they could salvage. It didn't matter. They were scanning everything. And after a while, all you heard was Larry say, "All fighters RTB, frigates, redock, and salvage teams, you're up." With that, she saw on the holographic screen next to her how every single one of the ship immediately turned and returned back to their bay. "I want an exact casualty report, and I mean exact, in the next 20 minutes. Aya responded, "Yes, sir. Already on it." "Good." With that, Gregnar could see that the radio began to come to life, and she heard in her own language, "Who the hell are you?" Gregnar smiled as she realized who it was. It was one of the Alphas, the brother of her father. She realized this and immediately got on the comms and got a hold of them. They talked for a little while, and yet her uncle didn't realize this was her until he got a visual. Although the look on his face of almost sheer disgust that she had changed herself into the human form was enough to make her almost want to ask Larry to turn the ship around. But she didn't. They simply talked about how they had taken down the Celtipsian main battle group along with their Zeknekel counterparts. This was not the main battle group, Larry told them. "What are you talking about? You just tore them apart." "No, our intelligence states that this was just a small battle group. Their main battle group is massing right now and getting ready to head for the heart of your territory." "What the fuck?" Before he could even finish that, all the information started spilling into his computer, showing exactly the masses, the numbers of all the different ships that were being amassed, that were getting ready to go into forced territory, and they were not going to stop at the border worlds. No, the border worlds were a distraction. The border worlds were meant to pull the forces away from the forced home world, as the home fleet was extremely dangerous. Even with the combined forces of the Zelnekel and the Celtipsian, there was no way they could go through an entire forced armada. But if they drew enough away, then they had a good chance. A good chance of making sure they got their main forces in and started tearing the creatures apart along with their ships before any of their reinforcements could turn around and return. This made all their hairs stand up. It was the only time Gretnar actually saw Larry crack a small smile and then immediately drop it. "Then what should we do? We can't leave this planet. This is under my jurisdiction. If I go down, the whole planet goes down." "Yes, I am well aware of the way your planet does things, which is why I'm here, by the request of your niece. So, by the way, disrespect her one more time, and I swear to God I will turn my guns on you. Are we clear?" Immediately, Gretnar's uncle straightened up as he realized this was not a threat. This was simply a show of respect for his own wife and a demand for respect for her, as she has shown no disrespect. In their culture, this is commonplace. In fact, it would be considered out of place if he didn't do so. Larry simply sent all the information along with receiving all the casualty reports, along with what the salvage teams were finding. The information was flowing in so fast, Gregnar couldn't figure out how Larry was able to handle it all. But she didn't ask. She was just amazed by this. She simply asked Aya, "Can I do anything for him? At this point, no, Aya simply stated very blankly. Her robotic voice would always be that of some sort of contention for Greknar, but she wouldn't really push it. Eventually, what came back was Greknar's uncle asking for them to aid in assaulting another planet, one that was under immediate attack. Larry, almost laughing. We don't have to worry about that. I got friends taking care of it. Eventually, they would send a recon flight over, but they wouldn't even get halfway there before they would hear all the traffic coming out of how another human ship, one or two, would show up seemingly out of nowhere and just start ripping apart the Zeknekel and Keltipsian battle groups. There wasn't anything left. They were done. Seriously, just done. And this made the Forced a little upset. Not that they survived, absolutely not, but the fact that someone had saved them. It hurt their pride, and in Forced society, the pride of the pride was everything. That was enough to make Greknar almost an outcast, moreover, as she kind of stomped on their pride, as she no longer gave a shit. Eventually, the front went quiet, at least those by the Forced. Larry could see by his communications that they had had a little bit more trouble on the other side. Vince and Femcast had done the same thing by tearing apart mainly a Zeknekel group. They're the ones that wanted the Nishani, of course. However, it wasn't going over all too well. Vince was more brazen than Larry, and because of that, he would drive straight into their formation and use even the smallest weapon system possible. Even if he could do that, he would also send out mines to blow up inside the formation, forcing the ships to run into each other. Subtlety was definitely not his strong suit. When they finally were able to establish communications after the battle, Larry was not surprised that Femcast was holding on to Vince. I mean, it was confusing to see. Immediately, Larry said, you're still in a war zone. You guys can do that later. Seriously, Femcast, please, can you put a shirt on while we're talking? With that, Greknar actually growled a little bit from the fact that Femcast had exposed herself in front of everybody. Although, for Femcast, this was not a big deal. For Greknar, it used to not be a big deal. But she realized the condition she was in, and also the position. With that, Greknar walked up and immediately started hugging up on Larry while he was talking. Larry simply put his arm around Greknar, and they continued to talk business. While working on a battle plan, there was something else. They were receiving communications from a whole bunch of different groups, different societies, different cultures from Earth, asking them what in the holy hell were they thinking? Going to war with two other species. They ignored these at first, but eventually, one of the Grand Admirals was able to get a hold of them and get in a sort of group chat, although it was more along the lines of holographic display. His exact start was, "What the hell were you thinking? With our numbers as low as they are, you really think this was a good idea?" Greknar was actually confused at this, and she would ask later. But eventually, Larry and Vince told them that they could not, in good conscience, sit and wait. Even if they had to fight this battle alone, they would fight it. Why? As Larry said, because we're human and we're men. That's why. The Grand Admiral couldn't say anything after that. Eventually, he finally said one thing. You're on your own on this one. However, if you retreat back to human space, we will protect you. But until then, you're on your own. That's fine by us, Larry would say. And immediately, the Grand Admiral cut loose. They watched closely to see what ships and what movement would be happening in the Zeknekel and the Kreltipsian fleets. However, there wasn't much movement, not as much as they would thought, because the loss of several battle groups within the course of 31 hours was just unheard of. They couldn't figure out how the Forced and the Nishani were able to actually pull fleets out like that. How could they bring such firepower, especially the Nishani? They're not a warrior race by any stretch of the imagination. They're engineers. Their actually main product that they sell is travel. They make some of the best engines out there, at least that most people thought. That is, until Femcast and Gretnar both did the numbers and realized that human engines were actually running at almost double the speed. It was not even possible, they thought, to get any faster than that. But, as Larry would say, it is what it is, as he didn't want to talk about it. As they got ready, it would take another few days before all the salvage was taken in. Many of the pieces were simply analyzed and, if worth nothing, chucked back outside the airlock. But if it was worth studying or worth bringing back, or in some cases holding on to, like different fighters and such, then they would keep it. And as the days clicked by, Greknar once again brought up a question she had. Why did your Grand Admiral say there's so few of you? Oh, that. Yeah. Yeah, something I forgot to mention. You see, after the transformation and we don't age anymore, how we regenerate and rejuvenate and all that fun jazz. Yeah, when that happened, our birth rates dropped into the toilet. Most women only have 1.8 children in a matter of 100 years now. It's very common for many women to go almost 200 years without children. That's insane, Gregnar said. This is the way it is. Why? Remember the whole thing about vanity? Oh, you've got to be kidding me. I would not kid you, kid. So, I mean, it is what it is. And why do you think we rely so much on automation? Look at the chief. Look at the rest of my drones. Well, I don't even like calling them that. It's what they come out of the factory being called. They're my sailors, my soldiers. Even Aya. She's there to help me out on so much. We rely so much on automation because of this. It's absolutely crazy. The only ones who actually reproduce at a higher rate is usually the zealots and the cultists that we have, mainly because they force people to do it. It's just part of the way they are. This is, oh my God. Gregnar was having trouble wrapping it around her head as she was slowly stroking her forehead. How? Why? Oh dear. Wait, does that mean you don't want to have children for 100 years? Larry burst out laughing. My dear, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. At this point, one, I'm not sure if our genetics line up, okay? If they do, chances are, considering the last couple of days, you're pregnant already. With that, Kreknar actually looked down at herself and rubbed her stomach with both hands. You think so? We won't know for a couple of weeks yet, but it's a possibility. It's a good possibility. I mean, all things considered. Well, how many items do we need to consider? Oh, never mind. Never mind. That was a foolish question. Yes, it was. He reached up, pulled her close, and kissed her on her forehead, and then held her close again, still having to wait several more days until the cleanup was finished, and they got a little bit more detail on the Keltipsian and Zutnekel fleets. Vince and many of the others, to include Jen, were getting a little antsy, and they wanted to get into the fight. Many of them wanted to know why there wasn't a consensus about going in and just attacking the fleet, the main body fleet, from all different sides at the same time. This would be a dangerous prospect, because if they left the front lines, they would leave it unguarded. Jen simply retorted, It doesn't matter. They don't know that we're here anyway. You got your shielding on, right? course I got my shielding on. But that doesn't mean that the moment they see us, they're not going to jump to FTL and go to places we can't protect. Yeah, that's true, but this waiting, we came out here to kick their ass, and we're not kicking their ass. Wait a minute, didn't you take out a couple battle groups yourself? Well, yeah, but I mean, those were just small fries. I mean, I want to get in for the big ones. Don't worry, looks like you're gonna get the big ones. What? Everyone look at your screens. I'm sending you the feed now. Looks like the fleet finally is mobilizing, but it's not going where we think it's going. Wait a minute, it's not going to the forced homeworld? Nope, definitely not going to the forced homeworld. Check this out. The Nishani. Nope. Looks like they're moving into Zeknekel territory. But from the way they're going and the way their jumps are, I can only think of one place they're going. Oh, you have got to be fucking me. Nope, nobody's fucking you except your wife. This is where they're going. Everyone looked at and their blood just ran cold. The fleet was heading towards a planet that they all know too well. They were heading straight for Theta 4. Theta was the name of the sector and obviously fourth planet. But this planet was known not only for its higher population, but also for the fact that it was a very peaceful agrarian/paradise world. Only about a third of it was used for agrarian. The rest was untouched and used for resorts. It didn't have a standing fleet, but it was a human planet just inside the zone, just on the other side of the line from the Zeknekel territory. Some of us worried about it, he thought. I didn't think they'd actually do it, those crazy sons of bitches. So, looks like we're getting to kick their ass all the same, right? You bet your ass. I'm in. And a few other cheers came from all the humans, and they had no argument from inside their own cockpit from any passenger they might have with them. Immediately, Greknar got a hold of the rest of the forced forces, and they began to move out. They let the force know that they were on their own, but to not let anyone know that they've left. It was agreed that the force would take care of everything, and weren't expecting any more combat, but they had a whole lot more salvaging and a whole lot more rebuilding to do. Many of their planets had been half glassed already, and now the humans weren't coming. The humans weren't going to be there to protect them. And now the humans left. They uncloaked themselves right before leaving into FTL space. You can't stay cloaked in FTL space. The physics don't work. Too many different energies, and you have more chance of blowing yourself up through either implosion or explosion if you keep that on. You're better just jumping into the edge of a system and immediately engaging the cloak. Some of them in the vessels might get a strange echo for a moment, but it's only a moment. Most of them will say, oh, it was just a rogue asteroid. Big deal. So what? It was off in the distance. Who gives a shit? And then they would just drift in. But this would not be the case. As it turns out, as the human ships all began to enter the system within minutes of each other, they found a shock. The planet was fine. There was no enemy fleets, no boats, no landing crafts, no nothing. They simply jumped in, and the first thing they heard was the planetary defense system call out to who was coming into the system. They identified themselves and wanted to figure out what in the flying hell was going on. What the hell was going on? The Keltipsian, the Zetnekel, they should be right here. Their whole fleet should be right here. This is where they were heading. Where in the hell were they? And it wasn't until they started talking that they realized that they had been played. The massive fleet had not only decided to go in one direction to try and confuse everyone, which they did, but as soon as they got a single jump in and realized they might not be tracked, or at least not easy, they immediately split and they headed right towards the Nishani and the forced homeworlds. They headed straight there without any hesitation. And now the humans realize they've been played. And humans don't like to be played. They turned their ships around and immediately left, but to their surprise, they were met with other human vessels. And these were far more well constructed as military vessels. Greknar believed that as she looked into each of the holographic display, and it showed all the different weapon systems. These were not simple frigates. These were not home away from home. These were warbirds. These were sent by the governments. Or were they? It wasn't until they got communications that they realized that several of the ship captains from other nations had petitioned their own governments to allow them to aid Larry and the others in taking down the Setnekel and the Keltipsian, as now they were on more than just friendly terms with the Nishani and the Force. No, no, no. They had joined them in battle and they had fought on the same side. This was deeper than they had realized. This was something that Greknar understood very well, but Femcast was confused as she was not a warrior race. Greknar simply told her about how the humans have a phrase: "He who shed blood with me shall be my brother." It was an old phrase, but it still rang true. And now the humans were not alone. The few that left, that were numbering barely a dozen, now jumped to over 35 different ships. And that was not all. More even showed up. The Nishani had been pleading with the humans for a long time. The Nishani had opened up commerce and allowed humans to come in and not only spend a whole bunch of money, but to vacation inside their area. And now that many of them had done through their transformations and were much more human, it was much easier for the humans to enjoy their area, and they did not want to lose such a jewel as that. The Force themselves, well, that was a whole nother bag of worms. Many of the ships didn't join Larry on his way back to the Forced homeworld, but some truly did. However, they would find out very quick that most of these actually did have some skin in the game, if you pardon the pun, because many of them actually had mates that were genetically modified, forced. One of them, to Greknar's absolute surprise, was her older sister. She was there on the holographic display with that full bleach blonde mane that went down almost to her ass. In fact, it was so low that every time she flicked her tail, she actually knocked a little bit of her hair. Greknar was amazed at this, not realizing that her older sister would actually enjoy being human. Knowing that this was a one-time deal, she couldn't go back. She knew that their father was not happy with the idea of Greknar changing, but apparently him showing up at her wedding actually did finally push her over the edge. And due to that, she realized that once she got in with the humans, she started dealing with the captains, the admirals, the other officers, and also the enlisted personnel. And she found out something very interesting about her new form. Humans enjoyed her new form, and so did she. And she was amazed that with her new form, she didn't feel the pinch at all. The pinch is what she feels, just like a house cat would feel to drop the eggs inside to make sure she gets pregnant. But no, that was not how it was anymore, and she enjoyed it far too much to ever give that up. However, she ended up realizing that many humans, at least those that remain, are very, very territorial, just like an alpha of the Forced. With all this information, Greknar was a little surprised at this. However, when she did talk to Larry about the subject, he reminded her that, "I'll tell you what, when this battle is over, I'm going to show you why it's better to have one guy. Because one guy is going to make sure you can't walk for a week." With that, her ears flicked as she realized he wasn't kidding. Though even with that, Greknar may have been a Force, but she was still a young lady. and she was a little jealous at the look that her sister had. She started to wonder if she would look better as a blonde, but Larry reminded her how much he enjoyed the fact that she was a green-eyed redhead who was, as he put it, the best piece of feline he's ever had. Every time he says this, Greknar thinks that he's joking because it doesn't seem that humans would be into that sort of thing, which she was thinking. However, then she realized that there must be something wrong with the translators. It just didn't go right. But she didn't have time to worry about it. They were getting close to the home planet, and this time they would be jumping in rather close, close enough that they would be seen at least for a moment. For sure, the enemy would know that there was a ship out there, but they wouldn't realize where they were. The plans were sent to the entire battle group, the human battle group, labeled about 9 ships, and they knew their sectors. They realized they had to be very careful where they were going because with the stealth fields on, they wouldn't be able to see each other. They needed to make sure they knew exactly what position they were going to go into, how they were going to line up, or they just might collide with each other. It was very similar to running submarines very, very close to each other. If you didn't have any type of active or even passive sonar, how do you know you're not going to crash into one another while you're trying to reach the destination? This was something that made all of them worry, because smashing into each other would immediately end the stealth field and they would be wide open with damaged ships, and they didn't want that. With Larry's ship directly in the center, they lined themselves up and jumped in from FTL. As soon as they did, they immediately covered themselves in their stealth fields, their cloaks, and all other types of making sure they were not seen. Now they were the unseen, but now the enemy knew they were around. There was no hiding them coming in from FTL that close. Yet it would only take about 15 minutes at most for the humans to reach the fleet. But the fleet realized something was wrong and was no longer trying to take down the forced ships. They didn't care. They realized that if something had come in and now they couldn't see it, something was very dangerous. Something was very wrong, and something needed to be hunted down, but they didn't know what. The Celtipsian, though not very fast, were definitely smart. The Zeknekel were also not the dumbest that were out there. They were ready for this. They knew the humans were very, very sneaky. They knew the humans loved ambush tactics, and they knew that the humans could make a hell of a shot. So they really, really had to be ready. And ready they were. With the forced units pushed all the way to the other side of the planet, they actually put their backs towards the planet and waited, getting themselves in formation to spread out their firepower and maximize it as best as possible. While watching this, Larry actually got nervous. "Oh shit," was all he said. As he got ready, he allowed the ship to drift very, very slowly. They knew where they had to be when the stealth fields came down, but now they were being actively searched. Different craft went out and around them, some of them so close they could actually start shaking the ship itself if they got any closer, that is. The gravity field that comes off a very dense object is something that can be picked up if you're close enough to it. Yet, they were still unseen, drifting closer and closer and closer and closer. Now, Larry's ship was lined up directly with the main dreadnought. He knew that on his dorsal side, spread out 45 degrees and about 3 kilometers away, was 2 other ships, and to his ventral side the same way. Spread out were the rest of the ships in a spindrill formation, again to maximize their own firepower. But now they simply had to wait. They had to wait to get everything lined up just perfect, because if they didn't, they would lose the first hit. You lose the first hit in space combat, you usually lose the battle. Not always, but it is usually the case. Closer, closer. As they went in, Gretnar began shaking. She was shaking so bad it could be heard throughout the bridge. Larry, without saying anything, without even opening his eyes, simply stated, "Yeah, pucker factor of over 9,000. Just try to stay still." Gretnar grabbed a hold of the chair, and it audibly started to squeak as her own muscle, which was a lot denser than she realized, began to actually bend the metal ever so slightly. With that, the chief was right behind her. The android himself had actually magnetically held himself to the plating and then put a hand on her shoulder as a way to try and comfort her just a little bit as they drifted closer and closer. With that, there was a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And as it reached zero, everything happened at the same time. The main guns, all four cannons, fired at the same time, going straight through the enemy flagship before they even realized what was happening. They were barely 2 kilometers away from the flagship when they fired. As the stealth field dropped, all manner of ordnance went flying out. They were already down on ordnance, down almost 20%, and now they were dropping 1 to 3% every few seconds. They simply ran like crazy, picking targets. Aya started screaming about how there were so many moving in she couldn't track them. He simply stated to deploy everybody, and I mean everybody. And with that, all the doors opened up. Every fighter, every corvette, and every other type of ship was immediately sent out into the fray. Some of them barely made it out of their docking bays before they were struck, but it didn't matter. Most of the larger ships were immediately out. With that, it wasn't just Larry's ship. No, it was all of them came in, scaring the living shit out of the Celtipsian and the Zeknekel forces as their main guns began to fire. Not only that, they were so close that the secondary, tertiary, and backup weapons all began to fire as well. Aya again started talking about how there was too many. Their percentages were starting to drop. Their percentage of survival. Larry simply gave the order, "Run 'em hot," which was to let them know that they were not to let the energy weapons even cool down. If it meant that the safety systems overran everything, fine, but they were just going to keep firing until it was impossible to keep firing. They would fire all their ordnance, all their missiles, their torpedoes, their rail guns, their main guns, everything would be fired continuously. There was no break in it. There was no, hold on, let me get a better angle. You just shot, you just fired, you just sent everything out. And in a mad minute, they began to tear into the fleet. They had already pierced through with 4 very large rounds the flagship, but the flagship was still active. They reloaded 4 more rounds as they saw the flagship begin to adjust its own turrets on the side. And again, 4 more rounds, not quite traveling down the same holes, but this time stripping right through the center. Larry rotated his ship around so that he would end up making another 4 perfect holes. Instead of a square, this would be a diamond shape straight through the center. Now, if there was any conduits that were still operational, if the bridge was in the center of the ship as it should be, it was now cut off from the rest of the ship. The engine compartment would be perforated. The bow was non-existent pretty much, as now more explosive ordnance began to strike into it. The battle itself was a complete furball for over 20 minutes. On the other side of the planet, the Forced realized what was going on and sent their forces back around, even though they knew they were severely outgunned by the forces that were trying to take their planet. Now they had backup. And now, even though they had pulled off their trick, the Zeknekel and the Celtipsian forces were caught in a classic pincer move. In desperation, many of them began to rotate their bows and turn away from both fleets and tried to ram, jumping into FDL speed. This was enough that the Celtipsian were a little pissed off, as the Zeknekel were the first ones to say, "Fuck this shit, I'm out," and immediately get the hell out of there as they realized that they had been flanked. They could not fire fast enough to put any of the human ships down. Inside Larry's ship, they were being bounced around like crazy. If not for his restraints, he would have immediately been tossed from one side of the bridge to the other and back again within a matter of seconds. The concussive force as rounds bounced off the hull, some of them piercing through the outer hull into the inner corridors. There was damage control teams being sent all over the place. Thankfully, there was no fires, no rapid decompression aside from the hull, of course. It was immediately being fixed. The drones were immediately going exactly to where they needed to be. The fighters on the outside immediately dumped all their ordnance into any fighter craft or corvette they had, and then began to strife the other ships with as much weapon fire as they could. It didn't matter if it was energy or ballistic weapons. They began to fire like mad into the enemy ships, and with that, they realized they had the biggest chance of winning. As they saw the four ships coming around the planet and begin to fire into the rear of the enemy ships, they realized that they had this now. Not only were the ships running extremely hot, to the point where most of the energy weapons were glowing visually, they were able to take down the biggest ships first. The Celtipsian believed that their massive dreadnoughts were completely unbeatable. Well, apparently they never seen a pissed off set of humans. And now, here they come. With that, the last of the Celtipsian ships, if still able to move, along with the Zeknekel, immediately turned and ran, leaving the rest to be torn asunder by the force. The human ships, as soon as they realized that the other side was pretty much done, they stopped firing and told the other side, the Zeknekel and Celtipsian, to surrender, which many of them did. But the Force didn't care. The Force came in with weapons blazing and tore every single ship apart. Larry and all the other humans screamed at them to stop firing. They had surrenders. They are no longer combatants, but the Force didn't care. They wanted a piece. Hell, they wanted all the pieces in tiny, tiny little pieces. And that's what they got. To everyone's surprise, the enemy forces had not made planetfall yet. They were apparently trying to take out the entirety of the Force Navy before they tried to land. This was a mistake, because they didn't get a chance. Many of their ground troops were tore apart inside their own ships, never really given a chance to drop. But this went just fine for the Force. They didn't want any part of it. They did not want any enemy on their own planets. It was bad enough. Several of their colony worlds had just been turned into basically slag. Not that they were actually destroyed, mind you, but anything bigger than a small village was simply leveled. There was no infrastructure left, and much of the nature itself had been destroyed. It was a disaster. But now, the Force were thinking about how they could counterattack. And it was not until many of the humans told them to look, we're not doing an invasion. We came to protect you, not to invade another hostile country. If you go in, you're on your own. With that, Greknar actually grabbed a hold of Larry and actually tried to pull him down with a look of, what are you talking about? Our fight was to protect you. Remember what I said about protecting and providing? Well, then you should provide support for our assault against the Celtipsian. They're the ones that started this. Doesn't matter. They're not our enemy, and I have to stay true to the code that we do follow. The code? Yeah, the code of being human. What? Look, I'll give you a few lessons on human history later. Let's just say you attack our allies, we will defend our allies, but we are not officially at war with them. If we were, do you have any idea how many ships we could have brought in here? The firepower that some of our own dreadnoughts can bring? I have no idea. With that, Larry said, oh, geez. Well, let me put it to you this way. You see how your planet has 3 moons? Yes? If one of our dreadnoughts came in and said, we don't want those moons there anymore, there wouldn't be moons there anymore. Ever. Gregnar's eyes got really big at the idea that three very large celestial bodies would have been torn apart, and that made her tail immediately drop. Larry had to comfort her a little bit, and eventually was able to get her to calm down long enough to get a hold of Vince and Femcast to let them know that everything was good on their side. Apparently, they were having a bit more trouble dealing with the Nishani area. As it turned out, the Nishani were not in any way, shape, or form ready for this invasion, and many of the enemy forces had actually landed on the planet. Larry thought for a moment, chuckled, and said, "So, does that mean you're going to send Tex down there? You know, she is a bit of a badass." Larry smiled at this and said, "Oh, yeah, she's already down there. She's, chewing bubble gum and kicking ass, and she's all out of bubble gum." With that, they both seemed to laugh, leaving both Gregnar and Femcast wondering what in the hell is up with these humans. By the time Larry and his battle group had actually got into Nishani space, let alone to their homeworld, the battle had been over. Vince and everyone else he was with had taken over, and the Nishani were more than a little grateful at this. Because of the fact that Vince and Femcast were now married, Vince offered to actually stay. He would leave his posting over there at the academy and defend the Nishani, using his own ship as kind of a deterrent. Everyone knew this was the best idea because if someone just out and out attacks the planet and they end up shooting at a human, well, they will bring all of humanity into war. And after seeing what a few non military ships and a few small destroyers were able to do, nobody, anywhere, wanted to fuck around and find out what the humans could do. A month later, Larry and Gretnar were back at the academy. They drew some strange looks, as many of the other humans did. Jen especially, but she really didn't care, just like most others. She simply made sure she kept her dark spectacles on and didn't make herself too much of a threat. Larry, being the fact that he worked out all the time, was still looked at as a very threatening sight, especially with Gregnar right next to him. Although Gregnar in the mornings was not quite feeling all that great about going to class. In fact, she wasn't feeling good at all in the mornings. Larry used to try and joke about what was going on, trying to figure out what's the best way to alleviate this issue. The Zeknekel and the Celtipsian that were still at the academy would always give them a wide berth, even though the Celtipsian would always eye them up and down with at least two of their four eyes. They never, ever said anything. Only one Zeknekel ever said anything to Gregnar, and she immediately punched him in the face with enough force to dislocate his jaw and send him to the ground unconscious. They realized since now she was mostly human, maybe she had human tendencies. Though now that their time at the academy was actually coming to an end, they faced an issue. What were they going to do for employment? What were they going to do with the rest of their lives? What was the plan? When Gregnar asked this of Larry, Larry simply looked down at her, held her close. After picking her up and giving her a hug, he whispered in her ear, "I thought I told you. I was given the position of instructor." She pulled back. "What?" "Yeah, I'm going to be teaching human culture here at the academy. Me and Jen, we're both going to be here because they want a human female perspective as well." Gregnar smiled and held Larry even closer, realizing that academy teachers actually pull down a shit ton of money because it is very difficult to get one to stick around for a while dealing with all the different species. However, the fact that humanity had just shown their hand and shown they are not ones to be fucked with, the chances are that, well, he would be paid exceptionally well and not leave. Along with the fact that, well, Most of the Zeknekel and Keltipsian were pulling themselves out of the academy and only be sending very few. Reason being, they were being sanctioned by several other species for their actions against the Nishani and the Forsh. And because of this, they just didn't have the funds to take care of this anymore. Though they were allowed a certain amount due to making sure that hostilities like this stay at a minimum, which was kind of the point of the academy in the first place. If they all grew up together, if they all understood each other, the chances of them actually going to a conflict would be far less. Although, as humans will say, war happens. Though one of the most interesting things that happens from war is that sometimes war can bring peace where it wasn't expected. An example of this was simple. Greknar, even though she was now expecting and she hadn't even told her family yet, she saw her little brother, the one that Larry had beaten before she even knew who Larry was. She knew that her little brother didn't like the fact that she had changed her biological form. She knew that her little brother hated the fact that his older sister was now married to a human. The whole idea disgusted him. However, the fact that Larry had shown that he was not only resilient, but also strong and able to protect his sister, this was the point where Gregnar's little brother walked up and for the first time, even though he wasn't at the wedding, put out his paws in the same way that they do in their own culture. They both touched, in this case it would be Gregnar's palms, and they rubbed their faces together just like any other cat. With this, Larry smiled, the biggest smile he had in a long time, outside of, his time he spent alone with his wife. As Gregnar's brother simply stated, "It's good to see you again, sister," knowing that she was now accepted back in the family, made Gretnar cry. This made Larry a little confused at what she was doing, and of course why she was crying, though soon enough he realized those were happy tears. Though Gretnar's brother put a more interesting spin on things when he stated something. I've been looking into your history, and it seems that you originally were persistent hunters. Yes, we were. Huh. How did you become the galaxy's ultimate ambush predator?